4 years ago, I buried my husband in an empty casket with no body inside. But yesterday, while checking into a luxury resort, my 7-year-old son suddenly yanked on my sleeve. His little face was completely pale, almost ghost-like. He leaned in close and whispered in a tiny, trembling voice that his dad was sitting right by the fountain. I turned around, fully expecting another cruel trick played by my own grief. Instead, I locked eyes with a ghost. My name is Paige, and I am 33 years old. For the past 4 years, my in-laws have gone out of their way to prove to the world that I lost my mind. They conveniently ignored the fact that after my husband's disappearance, I built a highly successful biotech visualization company from scratch. To them, I was just a needy, broken single mother surviving on their pity. I let them believe that because fighting their massive egos was just too exhausting, and all I wanted was some peace for my son, Leo. But that peace shattered the moment we stepped into this lobby. The air in the luxury Cabo San Lucas resort was thick with tropical heat and the scent of expensive flowers. I was only here because my mother-in-law, Beatrice, had guilt-tripped me for 2 months straight. She insisted I attend this annual family memorial retreat, claiming it was absolutely vital for Leo to feel connected to his father's memory. I was standing at the marble front desk, rummaging through my bag for our passports, when Leo suddenly grabbed the hem of my sundress. His hand was shaking. I looked down, about to ask if he wanted a drink, but his eyes were fixed beyond the wide lobby bar. He pointed a trembling finger toward the courtyard fountain. He whispered that his dad was sitting right there. I froze. Cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Over 4 years ago, Trevor had supposedly died in a boating accident off the coast of Florida. The Coast Guard never found his body. They only recovered his damaged sailboat and a stained life jacket. I had spent years in therapy processing that unresolved grief, trying to find closure without a goodbye. So when I turned my head, I fully expected to see a stranger with a similar profile, a painful but common trick of the mind. Instead, my phone slipped from my fingers, shattering face down on the marble floor. It was Trevor. He was sitting at a high-top table by the fountain, wearing a crisp linen shirt, looking more tan and healthy than he ever did during our marriage. He was casually swirling a margarita, laughing. Sitting across from him was a beautiful, visibly pregnant woman who was smiling and holding his hand. My lungs forgot how to breathe. My brain went completely numb, unable to process what was physically impossible. I took a step forward, every nerve ending in my body vibrating with shock. He must have felt my gaze because he turned his head. Our eyes locked. In that suffocating second, the entire universe stopped. I saw absolute terror flash across those familiar brown eyes. He didn't look confused. He looked like a fugitive caught red-handed. Trevor pushed his chair back so fast, he almost knocked over his drink. He grabbed the pregnant woman's arm, muttered something, and bolted toward the west wing of the resort, like a man running for his life. I screamed his name. The sound ripped from my throat, raw and desperate. I dropped our bags and ran across the lobby, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the wealthy vacationers around me. I dodged bellhops and luggage carts. My eyes locked on the corridor where my supposedly dead husband had just vanished. A split second before I reached the hallway, a vice-like grip clamped onto my upper arm, manicured nails digging deep into my skin. The sheer force jerked me backward, almost knocking me off balance. It was Beatrice. My mother-in-law's face was contorted in a mask of fury and calculation. Standing behind her was Trevor's older brother, Cameron, the family's golden boy, looking perfectly composed in his designer polo shirt. I clawed at her hand, pointing wildly down the corridor. I screamed that Trevor was right there, that I saw him, that he was alive and running away with another woman. Beatrice dug her nails deeper and hissed in my ear, her voice dripping with venom. She demanded I stop making a scene and embarrassing her. She spat that I was having another episode, accusing me of traumatizing my own son just to get attention. I looked back at the front desk. Leo was standing exactly where I left him, crying silently next to a worried concierge. My maternal instinct clashed violently with what I had just witnessed. I screamed at Cameron to let me go, struggling against Beatrice's grip. I yelled that Trevor was alive, that they needed to call security to lock down the resort before he got away. Cameron stepped forward, using his broad shoulders to physically block my path. He spoke to me in a patronizing tone, as if soothing a hysterical child. He told me Trevor was gone. He claimed the tropical heat was making me see things, and that I needed to go to my room and calm down, or they would have to call a doctor to sedate me. I shoved Cameron's chest. I wasn't crazy. The panic in Trevor's eyes was real. They knew. The realization hit me like a freight train. Beatrice wasn't surprised by my screaming. Cameron wasn't scanning the lobby, looking for his miraculously resurrected brother. They weren't shocked at all. Their only goal was to shut me up. I told them I was going to the police. I said I was going to get the resort's security footage to prove he was here. A cold, sharp laugh cut through the humid air. Simone stepped out from behind Cameron. My sister-in-law was a ruthless corporate attorney from New York. A brilliant, cutthroat woman who used intimidation like a second skin. Her tailored resort wear looked like expensive armor, her styled hair untouched by the ocean breeze. She stepped directly into my personal space, her dark eyes completely empty of empathy. She smiled, but it was the chilling grin of a predator. Simone told me to go take my meds. She stated in a flat voice that dead men don't drink margaritas in Cabo. She looked down at my shaking hands, then glanced across the lobby at a crying Leo. Her voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper. She told me that if I took one more step down that hallway or caused another scene, she would have Child Protective Services at the resort within an hour. She coldly reminded me that as a senior partner at a top law firm, she would personally ensure that an unstable, delusional widow lost custody of her child by sunset. The threat felt like a physical blow. My breath caught. I knew Simone wasn't bluffing. She had the connections and the resources to make my life a living nightmare. She knew the law inside out and knew exactly how to bend it to crush anyone who stood against her family. But what Simone didn't know was that the fragile widow she thought she could bully had just closed an $80 million acquisition in New York the week before. I wasn't that vulnerable illustrator anymore. I was a CEO who knew exactly how to fight in a boardroom war. I looked at Simone's blank face, at Beatrice's smug expression, and at Cameron's cold stance. They were an unbreakable wall of deception, perfectly happy to let me believe I was losing my mind, perfectly willing to take my child, all to protect the ghost roaming the West Wing. I stopped struggling. I let my arms fall to my sides, even though my heart was pounding against my ribs. I watched my son wipe his tears. Then, I looked at the three monsters standing in front of me. At that moment, I knew my husband hadn't drowned. He had just sailed into a new life, and his family paid for the ticket. The next morning, the bright sun reflected off the resort's turquoise waters, but my blood ran cold. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my standard room, staring blankly at my reflection. In my hand was a crumpled bar receipt. I had gone out to the fountain in the dead of night to find it, after the family had forced me to my room. The condensation from the margarita glass had smudged the ink, but the name at the top was perfectly clear. Trevor Vance, room 412. Vance was no coincidence. It was Beatrice's maiden name, the exact name she used for her offshore shell companies. My dead husband was not only alive, he was fully funded. I smoothed down my simple linen dress and took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. Today required a flawless performance. If Simone and Beatrice wanted to treat me like a grieving, delusional widow, I was going to give them a textbook show. I tapped my pocket to ensure my phone was recording, took Leo's hand, promised him a special morning adventure, and headed to the main terrace for the mandatory family breakfast. The terrace was packed with the resort's elite, wealthy investors, corporate giants, and socialites sipping mimosas under massive white umbrellas. Beatrice sat at a large, sun-drenched corner table, holding court like royalty. Cameron and Simone sat beside her, looking like the ultimate untouchable power couple. I kept my head down, shoulders slumped, as I led Leo toward the table. Before I could even pull out a chair, Beatrice raised her voice. She timed it perfectly so the wealthy guests at neighboring tables could hear every word. She sighed dramatically, telling her friends what a tragedy it was. Pointing a manicured finger at me, she announced to strangers that I was suffering from severe grief-induced delusions. She claimed I couldn't separate reality from trauma, painting me as a broken, unstable woman clinging to dangerous fantasies. Simone chimed in with a tight, patronizing smile, loudly, suggesting that for Leo's safety, they might need to legally evaluate my living situation before I had a complete breakdown. I swallowed the burning rage in my throat. I played my part perfectly, nodding submissively and staring at my hands as if I really had lost my mind. I walked over to the buffet to pour a cup of hot black coffee. Cameron was sitting at the table, eyes glued to his phone, his thumbs sliding rapidly across the screen. I timed my steps perfectly. As I passed his chair, I feigned a stumble, twisting my wrist just enough to send the hot coffee splashing across the table and dive directly onto Cameron's pristine, white designer trousers. Cameron cursed loudly, pushing his chair back as his phone clattered onto the table. The screen stayed lit, face up in the spilled coffee. While Beatrice screamed about my clumsiness, and Cameron scrambled to wipe his pants, I immediately dropped to my knees, pretending to help clean up the mess. My eyes locked onto his phone screen like a hawk. There was a new text message. The sender was saved only as TV. The message was brief and panicked. Get that crazy woman away from the West Wing. Beatrice had clearly had enough. Disgusted by my apparent incompetence, she snapped open her designer bag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slapped it onto the table. She ordered me to take the money, take my son to the public beach, and buy him some cheap ice cream. She hissed that I was ruining their upscale social brunch and ordered me to stay out of their sight until dinner. I didn't throw the money back in her face. I didn't scream. I apologized in a small, timid voice, quietly picked up the coffee-stained bill, and took Leo's hand. As I walked away from the terrace, a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Beatrice genuinely thought she was funding a charity case. She thought that $100 bill was a display of absolute power over a destitute widow. She had no idea that just last week, while sitting at my kitchen island helping Leo with his homework, I had finalized an $80 million buyout for my biotech visualization company. I had enough liquid cash in my account to buy this entire resort, fire the management, and throw my in-laws out before lunch. But power is most lethal when your enemy has no idea you hold it. Instead of heading to the beach, I turned my back to the ocean. Holding Leo's hand tightly, I told him we were going on a secret treasure hunt. Avoiding the main elevators, we took the service stairs and made our way to the West Wing. The air grew colder as we navigated the quiet, plush-carpeted hallways. I stopped in front of a heavy mahogany door. Room 412. The room from the receipt. The area Cameron was supposed to keep me away from. My pulse pounded in my ears. I raised my fist and knocked firmly on the wood. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward. Standing there was the polished, heavily pregnant woman, one hand protectively cradling her baby bump. She looked at me with polite confusion, asking how she could help. The words caught in my throat. I opened my mouth to confront her, to demand answers, to ask who she was. But before I could utter a single syllable, a man stepped out from the shadows of the suite. He placed a protective, loving hand on her shoulder. It was Trevor, my dead husband. The heavy mahogany door shut with a solid, definitive thud. The beautiful pregnant woman was gently pushed back inside, her confused voice completely cut off by the solid wood. Now, in the brightly lit corridor of the West Wing, I was face to face with my husband's ghost. I had prepared myself for a wave of apologies. I expected him to break down in tears, begging for forgiveness. I thought Trevor would drop to his knees, telling me he had been forced into hiding by dangerous people and did it all to protect our family. That's the kind of lie I would have made up to soften the blow. But Trevor didn't kneel. He stood tall, ran a hand through his styled hair, and glared at me. He stepped forward, pinning me against the textured silk wallpaper. He looked me up and down with absolute disgust. His first words were, "You always have to ruin everything." The sheer arrogance of his words felt like a physical blow to my chest. In those familiar brown eyes, there was no remorse, only deep annoyance that I had interrupted his luxury vacation. I stared at the man I had spent 4 years mourning, the man whose absence forced me to explain death to a toddler. Trevor crossed his arms, not even bothering to lower his voice. Right there in the hallway, he arrogantly laid out the ugly truth. He admitted that 4 years ago, his boutique investment firm was bleeding cash. He was weeks away from federal fraud indictments and total financial ruin. Instead of facing a federal prison sentence, he decided to start over. With full financial backing from Beatrice and Cameron, he faked that boating accident off the Florida coast. It was a flawless exit strategy designed to leave me holding the bag. But the real mastermind, he bragged, was Simone. My sister-in-law had found the legal loopholes to declare him dead without a body and helped Beatrice launder the $10 million life insurance payout. They used Beatrice's maiden name, Vance, to move the cash through offshore shell companies, completely erasing the money trail. Trevor leaned in, his breath smelling of premium tequila and lime. He told me I was just a naive, struggling single mom who drew pictures for a living. He mocked my background in medical illustration, completely unaware that my once teeny startup had become an industry giant. He ordered me to pack my cheap bags, take Leo, and go back to my struggling life. He warned me that if I said a word to anyone, Simone would bury me in lawsuits so deep I'd never see the light of day, and I'd never see my son again. A year ago, that threat would have broken me. I would have collapsed on the carpeted floor, crying and begging for answers. But the fragile woman Trevor had abandoned died the day she realized she had to be both mother and father. The woman standing before him now was a battle-tested CEO who dismantled hostile takeovers before breakfast. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't slap his face. Instead, my eyes drifted to his left wrist. Peeking out from under his linen sleeve was a heavy platinum Rolex Daytona. It was the exact watch I had saved up for 2 years to buy him for our 5th anniversary. This was the very watch Beatrice had tearfully claimed she recovered from the yacht wreckage. She told me she had buried it in his empty casket for sentimental reasons. Seeing it on his wrist was the ultimate proof of their arrogant carelessness. They were so confident in their wealth and power that they didn't even bother to hide the evidence. I looked back up at his face and smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that didn't reach my eyes. Trevor mistook my silence for submission. He thought my smile was the breakdown of a defeated woman. He scoffed, reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it against my chest. He told me there was $10,000 inside, calling it a generous payout for my travel troubles. He told me to take the cash, keep my mouth shut, and get out of the resort before dinner. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the $100 bills. The irony was beautiful. My dead husband was trying to buy the silence of a woman who had just deposited $80 million into her business account 5 days ago. Without a word, I turned and walked down the long corridor toward the elevators. My mind was already calculating my next move, drafting an urgent email to my aggressive legal team in New York. But as I rounded the corner, my confident steps came to a halt. The hallway ahead was empty, except for one person blocking my only exit. It was Simone. My sister-in-law stood at the end of the hall, her posture rigid and hostile. In her immaculate scarlet power suit, she looked every bit the legal predator she was. Her arms were crossed, a triumphant, smug sneer on her face. In her hand, she held a thick legal folder. Printed in bold black letters on the cover were the words, Leo Custody Petition. The harsh fluorescent lights of the West Wing glinted off the white folder. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Simone stood her ground, her red suit a stark contrast to the relaxed resort vibe. As a highly successful corporate lawyer, she was used to dominating every room she entered. Her dark eyes were cold, devoid of any warmth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Simone stepped forward and grabbed my wrist with a grip like a steel clamp. Before I could call for security, she shoved me through the heavy metal fire door and pulled me into the concrete stairwell. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the resort's soft background music and plunging us into a suffocating, echoing silence. She thrust the folder against my collarbone, forcing me to take it. She told me to open it and read the first page. She said she had drafted emergency custody papers, ready to file back home. She claimed she had signed affidavits from Beatrice and Cameron stating that I was an unfit mother suffering from violent, unpredictable delusions. She leaned in so close I could smell her expensive perfume. She whispered that with one phone call, the local authorities would escort me to a psychiatric facility, while she legally flew my son back to the States to live with her. I gripped the folder, my knuckles turning white. I asked her how they could do this. How could they fake a death and let me mourn a man who was sitting by the pool drinking margaritas? I needed her to say it. I needed her arrogance to override her legal caution. Simone laughed, a sharp sound echoing off the concrete walls. Blinded by her own sense of superiority, she couldn't resist bragging about her brilliant legal maneuvering. She detailed exactly how she had paid off a corrupt coroner in Florida to swap Trevor's dental records with an unidentified victim of another accident. She laid out the exact timeline she used to claim the $10 million life insurance payout, boasting about how easily she bypassed federal scrutiny, using her reputation as a top firm partner. She explained how she and Beatrice laundered the money through offshore shell companies under the Vance name. Simone looked down at the thick envelope of cash Trevor had just given me and sneered. She told me I was completely out of my league. She mocked my background in medical illustration, laughing at the years I spent drawing anatomy for textbooks, while Trevor allegedly built an empire. She asked if a girl who drew pictures really thought she could outsmart a Harvard-educated partner. She told me my entire existence was just a charity project funded by the family I was threatening to expose. She had no idea that those drawings had evolved into proprietary biotech visualization software used by major hospital networks worldwide. She had no idea I was the sole owner of a company that had just been acquired for $80 million. I knew exactly what my strategy had to be. If I fought her in this stairwell, she would use every resource to shut me down before I could secure my assets. I needed her to feel absolute, unchallenged dominance. I needed her to believe she had completely broken me. So, I let go. The envelope of cash slipped from my fingers and hit the concrete floor with a thud. I forced my breathing to become shallow and heavy. My knees buckled, and I let myself collapse onto the cold, hard ground. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing hot tears to stream down my face. Wrapping my arms around myself, I began to plead. I sobbed, begging her not to take my son, promising to pack my bags, keep quiet, and pretend I never saw Trevor. Simone looked down at me with immense satisfaction. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her red dress. She ordered me to pick up the cash, clean up my face, and go back to my room. She told me to put on the nicest dress I had and show up at the family's charity dinner that night. She warned me that if I acted like anything less than a grateful, grieving widow, she would have Child Protective Services on the phone before the appetizers were even served. The heavy metal fire door creaked open, then shut with a deafening bang. The sharp click of Simone's high heels faded down the hallway, eventually dissolving into a suffocating silence. I sat there on the cold concrete floor for exactly 10 seconds. Then, I stopped crying. My breathing instantly evened out. My heart rate slowed to a cool, steady rhythm. The fake trembling in my hands vanished. I stood up, brushed the dust off my knees, and reached into the hidden pocket of my linen dress to pull out my phone. The screen was still lit, and the red recording icon was flashing away. I hit stop, saving the 20-minute audio file directly to my company's highly secure, encrypted cloud server. I had Trevor's confession from the hallway, and now, I had ironclad evidence of Simone in that stairwell, detail by detail explaining a massive federal insurance fraud scheme. I picked up the $10,000 in cash and walked back to my room with a firm, steady stride. Leo was still inside, safely watching cartoons. I locked the deadbolt, hooked the security chain, and opened my laptop. Bypassing the resort's insecure public network, I logged directly into my encrypted corporate portal. I opened a secure video channel and dialed my chief corporate counsel in New York, Miles. If Simone knew what Miles charged per hour, she would have choked on her champagne. He picked up on the first ring, looking perfectly sharp and composed in his high-rise office. I looked at the screen, stripping all emotion from my voice. I told him I needed an immediate tactical strike. I ordered him to trace every single shell company under the name Vance and use our newly acquired capital to freeze their offshore accounts completely. I told him it was time to burn their empire to the ground. I snapped the laptop shut. The encrypted video call had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was enough to detonate a financial bomb. Miles was already tracking the offshore accounts. Simone and Beatrice had used to launder Trevor's life insurance money. In the shadows, the digital war had officially begun. But tonight, I was going to wage a very real, very public physical war in the resort's ballroom. Earlier that afternoon, Beatrice had forced her way into my standard room using her master key. With a look of utter disgust, she threw a cheap plastic garment bag onto the edge of my bed. Inside was a shapeless, faded beige dress that looked like it had been rotting in a mothball-filled attic for a decade. Beatrice patronizingly ordered me to wear it to the family's charity dinner tonight. She instructed me to stand near the kitchen doors, keep my head down, and absolutely not speak to any of their wealthy investors. In her script, I was meant to play the pathetic dependent charity case, surviving on their generosity. It was a calculated move to publicly humiliate me and reinforce their narrative that I was incompetent and fragile. Standing by the bed, staring at that hideous beige fabric, a bitter, mocking laugh escaped my lips. I picked up the dress and threw it directly into the trash can without a second thought. They truly believed I was still that broke artist living off their scraps. They had no idea that I had planned a completely different kind of celebration for tonight. I walked over to my luggage and unzipped a heavy canvas garment bag. Hanging inside was a breathtaking, custom emerald green silk gown. A few weeks ago, to celebrate my company's successful buyout, I had spent $15,000 on this masterpiece at a high-end boutique in Manhattan without blinking. Its tailoring was flawless, designed to command respect in Wall Street boardrooms and at elite galas. I spent an hour transforming myself. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight bun, a sharp style that highlighted the angles of my face. I put on a pair of diamond teardrop earrings I'd bought with my own hard-earned money. When I looked in the mirror, the terrified, bullied widow was completely gone. Now, looking back at me was a CEO, ready to tear her enemies apart on their own turf. The resort's grand ballroom was dazzling, lit by crystal chandeliers and filled with the scent of towering white orchids. In the corner, a string quartet played softly as servers in white gloves moved through the crowd with silver trays of premium champagne. The room was packed with elite investors and venture capitalists. The exact Wall Street players. Cameron and Simone were desperately trying to win over for their next sketchy real estate project. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the ballroom. The effect was instant. The quiet chatter near the entrance died down. Heads turned. Wealthy guests stopped mid-sentence, their eyes locked on the liquid glow of the emerald green silk, shifting with every confident step I took. I didn't sneak toward the kitchen doors like a mouse. I walked straight toward the center of the ballroom, radiating absolute, unshakable authority. Across the room, Beatrice was holding court with a group of older socialites. The moment she saw me, her jaw dropped in horror. Her crystal champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor. Simone was standing near the bar, her dark eyes narrowing into angry slits. Her scarlet suit practically bristled with shock and jealousy. Both of them were absolutely seething, but they were frozen. They couldn't scream at me or drag me into a stairwell to threaten my child in front of this crowd. They were surrounded by the very high society investors they desperately needed to impress. However, Cameron couldn't handle this sudden shift in power. He excused himself from a group of Wall Street executives and marched toward me, his tanned face flushing with anger. For the sake of the onlookers, he forced a tight, fake smile, but the moment he reached me, his fingers clamped onto my arm like a vice. He leaned in, demanding to know what I was doing and where I had gotten that dress. He hissed that I was a parasite, trying to ruin their high-profile event. I smoothly slid my arm out of his grip, flashing a bright, dazzling smile to the surrounding crowd. I quietly told him I was just enjoying the dinner. A cruel look flashed in Cameron's eyes. He decided to take me down the only way he knew how, by humiliating me publicly. He aggressively guided me toward his circle of investors. With a nauseating display of patronizing pity, he introduced me to the wealthy, older men. He announced that I was his poor, widowed sister-in-law, Paige. He even spun a tragic lie about how difficult my life had been and how his family had financially carried me just to keep me afloat. The investors offered polite, sympathetic looks. Then, Cameron turned to me, treating me like hired help. He told me to be a good girl, go to the bar, and fetch a round of their finest aged scotch, adding that a dependent like me should at least try to make herself useful. I didn't flinch. I didn't show an ounce of embarrassment. I gave Cameron a warm, dangerous smile and told him it would be my absolute pleasure. I walked elegantly to the bar, ordered 4 of the most expensive aged scotches on Cameron's tab, and placed them on a silver tray. Walking back through the crowd, I could feel Simone's glare burning into my back. I approached the group and flawlessly handed a heavy crystal glass to each man. Cameron smirked, thoroughly satisfied with my apparent submission. He opened his mouth to dismiss me back to the shadows, but before he could say a word, I turned to the lead investor, a well-known billionaire named Richard Montgomery. I held out my hand, my voice clear and steady over the music. I introduced myself with professional poise. I'm Paige Kensington. Richard Montgomery froze, his scotch glass suspended in mid-air. He stared at my face, then down at my outstretched hand. A look of deep shock and recognition washed over him. He eagerly shook my hand, his eyes wide. He turned to Cameron, his booming voice cutting through the quiet circle like a thunderclap. He demanded to know if Cameron was playing some kind of joke, asking why on earth he was treating me like a servant. Richard Montgomery proudly announced to the entire group that this was Paige Kensington, the brilliant CEO who had just executed the $80 million buyout of Apex Medical last week. The circle of Wall Street giants went completely silent. The pity in their eyes vanished, replaced by instant respect. The smug grin on Cameron's face withered away. His jaw dropped, and his skin turned a sickly gray. He looked at me as if I had just vacuumed the air straight out of his lungs. Richard's voice echoed through the grand ballroom. The Wall Street tycoons were stunned, their expensive drinks forgotten. Cameron was frozen like a statue, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, while the very investors he had spent months kissing up to suddenly crowded around me. They were eager to shake hands with the CEO who had just pulled off the biggest biotech acquisition of the quarter. I smiled warmly, offering firm handshakes and answering their questions with the smooth executive polish I had used for years. I let Cameron squirm in public humiliation for 5 full minutes. His face had turned a pale, sickly color, looking as if he might pass out right there on the marble floor. Having completely shattered his power play, I politely excused myself to freshen up and glided out of the circle, my emerald silk flowing behind me. I knew exactly who would follow me. The resort's main restroom was a lavish space with gold-trimmed mirrors, crystal sconces, and pink marble counters. The moment I set my evening bag down, the double doors burst open. Beatrice stormed in, her face red with rage, with Simone right behind her, moving like a snake ready to strike. Simone quickly flipped the deadbolt on the door, locking us inside. Beatrice pointed a shaking, diamond-ringed finger at my face. She shrieked that I was a pathological liar and a psychopath, accusing me of humiliating their family by spinning delusions to Richard Montgomery. She ordered me to go back out there, tell the investors I had a breakdown, and admit I had confused my little drawing hobby with a real company. Simone stepped in front of Beatrice, taking control of the confrontation. Her red suit seemed to absorb the light in the room as she glared at me with pure contempt. She told me my performance was pathetic. She said she didn't know how I had heard about the Apex medical deal, but that posing as a CEO was corporate fraud. She threatened to call local security to have me arrested, claiming my arrest record would be the perfect excuse to permanently strip custody of my son. I didn't back down. I didn't look away or take a step back. I reached into my bag, pulled out a lipstick, and calmly applied it in the mirror, locking eyes with Simone's reflection. Then I turned around, shedding the fragile widow act entirely. I stood tall, shoulders back, stepping into the commanding CEO persona I used to dismantle tech executives in New York. I told Simone she was slipping. I said, "A Harvard-educated partner should know how stupid it is to threaten a multimillionaire in a locked room." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to stand her ground. I told her I hadn't just read about the Apex medical buyout. I ran it. I owned the patent. While she and Beatrice were busy burying an empty casket for the past 4 years, I had built an empire. Simone let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, trying to maintain her dominance. She told me I had lost my mind and that my grief had turned into full-blown psychosis. So, I hit her with the facts. I looked her dead in the eye and recited a 16-digit bank routing number. I stated the precise offshore bank code. I named Vance Holdings. I detailed the exact date and time 4 years ago, when the $10 million fraudulent life insurance payout was wired to an account in the Cayman Islands. I told her I knew she was the architect of the entire plan, describing how she swapped dental records, paid off the coroner in Florida, and laundered the blood money using her mother-in-law's maiden name. Simone's laughter died instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow. Her confident stance crumbled in less than a second. She instinctively took a step back, her spine hitting the cold marble wall. Beatrice let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest in pure, unadulterated panic. I stepped closer, invading Simone's personal space just as she had done to me in the stairwell. I kept my voice dangerously low, stripped of any warmth. I told them my legal team in New York was already dismantling their offshore accounts. I explained that I had access to every fraudulent transaction they had ever made. They thought they were predators, but they were just amateurs playing with federal crimes. I delivered my ultimatum. I told Simone and Beatrice they had exactly 24 hours to turn themselves in to the authorities for insurance fraud, faking a death, and money laundering. If they did, I would watch them go down from a distance. But if they tried to run, if they moved a single dollar, or if they ever threatened my custody of Leo again, I would unleash a legal and financial storm that would destroy their entire family. I picked up my evening bag, unlocked the door, and walked out without looking back. I left two of the most terrifying women I knew standing in a suffocating, trembling silence. As I walked back to my room, adrenaline surged through my veins. I had them cornered. I had their confessions on a secure cloud server, and my lawyers were freezing their assets. Now, I just needed to get Leo, pack our bags, and move to a highly secure hotel across the bay. I had left Leo with a thoroughly vetted resort babysitter, and he had been fast asleep. But now, I just wanted my son in my arms. Yet, as I turned the final corner toward my room, the warmth of my victory turned to ice. My door was wide open. The heavy wood was splintered around the lock. It had been kicked in. Panic seized my throat. I sprinted the last few yards and burst into the room. The place was trashed. My luggage had been ripped open, clothes scattered everywhere. I looked frantically at the bed where I had left my son. It was empty. The babysitter was gone. With a sickening shudder, I realized my decoy laptop was missing from the desk. The thick manila envelope containing the $10,000 was gone from the nightstand, too. The balcony doors were closed, and the heavy blackout curtains were drawn shut, plunging the room into deep shadow. A figure emerged from the corner of the room. Trevor stepped into the dim light, breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists. He looked nothing like the smug ghost from the hallway. He looked desperate and dangerous. In his hand, he held my smashed laptop. With a sickening crunch, he threw it onto the carpet. He took a step toward me, his voice a low animal growl. "Did you think you were clever, Paige?" Trevor spat from the shadows. "I just deleted everything." Trevor kicked the broken pieces of my laptop across the carpet. The sound of cracking plastic and snapping circuit boards echoed through the dark, messy room. He closed the distance between us, using his height to throw a long, threatening shadow over me. He pinned me against the heavy blackout curtains, his chest heaving. He pointed a finger, inches from my face, his voice dripping with venom. He told me I was the same naive, pathetic woman he had walked away from 4 years ago. He mocked me, saying I was always too busy drawing silly anatomy sketches to notice his investment firm collapsing right under our roof. He pressed closer, keeping me trapped against the window. He called me an awful mother, claiming I had dragged our son to Mexico just to play the grieving widow for attention. He bragged about how easily he had slipped into my room, found my cheap computer, and destroyed the only leverage I had against him. He truly believed he had won. He thought physical intimidation and breaking a piece of hardware would shrink me back into the crying, desperate wife he remembered. He ordered me to take my son out, accept my miserable life, and get out of the resort before he lost his temper. I looked down at the plastic and silicone scattered across the floor. Then, I looked up at his sweating, angry face. I didn't scream. I didn't flinch when he raised his hand, and instead, I started to laugh. It wasn't a hysterical, panicked laugh. It was a low, genuine chuckle that came from deep in my chest, filling the dark room. Trevor froze. His hand lowered slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion and anger. He demanded to know what was so funny when my life was ruined. I stepped away from the curtains, closing the gap between us, forcing him to take a step back. I asked him if he honestly believed a woman running an $80 million tech firm kept her core data on a local hard drive. I watched his eyes widen as the words registered. I explained that my company didn't just draw pictures. We handled terabytes of highly sensitive patient data for major hospital networks. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "My entire business is built on military-grade encrypted cloud architecture." I smiled, pointing to the debris on the floor, and kindly informed him that the computer he had just proudly smashed was an $800 travel decoy. There was nothing of value on it. The arrogance on Trevor's face melted into a pale, sickly gray. I kept pressing, my voice sharp and relentless. I told him that the moment he walked away from me, earlier today, his confession in the hallway was uploaded directly to my company's secure servers. I told him Simone's arrogant rant in the concrete stairwell, detailing every step of their $10 million fraud, was sitting right next to it. I stepped closer, enjoying the sudden smell of fear radiating off him. I whispered that my chief counsel in New York had already downloaded the files. I watched him gasp, and then I delivered the final blow. I told him that 2 hours ago, my legal team handed the entire digital evidence package over to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Trevor stopped breathing. The reality of federal charges hit him like a collapsing building. His knees physically buckled. He stumbled backward, tripping over my knocked-over suitcase, and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. The aggressive man who had just threatened me was gone. In his place sat a shaking, pathetic coward. He held up his hands, his voice breaking as he began to beg. He started hyperventilating, crying for me to call off my lawyers and stop the federal agents. To save himself, he immediately threw his own family under the bus. He swore faking his death was all Beatrice's idea. He sobbed that Simone had forced him into the laundering scheme, claiming she would have ruined him if he didn't comply. He insisted he was just a pawn in their corporate game, swearing he never wanted to leave me or our son. He fell to his knees on the carpet, surrounded by my scattered clothes. He offered me the remaining cash he had taken, begging for forgiveness. He promised that if I made one call to stop the investigation, he would disappear to another continent and never bother us again. I stood over him, feeling nothing but disgust. The man I had mourned, the man I had cried over for 4 years, was whimpering on the floor of a hotel room like a cornered rat. I looked down at him and said coldly, "Federal agents don't negotiate with ghosts." Before I could tell him to get out of my sight, a sound broke the tension in the room. The broken door, hanging loose on its hinges, was pushed wide open. The bright light of the hallway flooded into the dark room, illuminating the mess on the carpet. Standing in the doorway was the pregnant woman from the fountain. Her eyes swept over the torn luggage, the smashed electronics, and finally landed on the whimpering man, clutching the edge of the bed. Her hands flew to her pregnant belly, her face a mask of pure horror. She looked at the man on the floor, her voice trembling. She asked Trevor what was going on. Then she looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, and asked who I was. I didn't wait for Trevor's lying mouth to make up an excuse. I didn't give him the chance to spin another web. I turned to her, my posture straight, and offered a warm, bright smile. I said, "Hi, I'm his widow." Then, I asked her who she was. The pregnant woman stood frozen in the doorway. Her hands clutched her belly as her eyes darted between the broken laptop, the scattered clothes, and the man she thought she knew. Trevor scrambled up from the carpet like a cornered animal, his face pale and dripping with sweat. He reached out to her, his voice frantic, as he stepped over the broken electronics. He tried to grab her shoulders, stammering that I was just a crazy hotel guest, a delusional stalker who had broken into his room. He begged her to step back into the hallway. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move from my spot by the window. I simply looked at the beautiful woman and called her by her full name. "Hello, Alyssa Bradley." Trevor froze. Alyssa flinched, her eyes snapping to my face. She demanded to know how I knew her name. I stepped over the debris, walking slowly across the room. I told her I knew exactly who she was because I knew exactly who her father was. I explained that her father was Warren Bradley, the billionaire real estate mogul my brother-in-law, Cameron, had spent the entire weekend trying to secure a massive corporate merger with. I watched the realization hit her. In the dim light of the room, I laid out the ugly truth. I told Alyssa that Trevor hadn't just accidentally started a new life in Mexico. He had targeted her. He had created a fake identity to infiltrate her family, intending to marry into her wealth, to cover the assets he had lost through his own criminal incompetence. I explained that the man standing in front of her wasn't a successful businessman. He was a fugitive facing multiple federal fraud charges. I told her he had faked a boating accident 4 years ago, leaving me to raise our son alone, while his family laundered $10 million in life insurance money. Trevor began to scream hysterically. He yelled at Alyssa not to listen to me, calling me a psychotic liar. He grabbed her arm, trying to physically pull her out of the room. Alyssa ripped her arm away with incredible force. She looked around the wrecked room, taking in the pure desperation rolling off Trevor. She turned back to me, her voice shaking but firm, and demanded proof. I didn't hesitate. I recited Trevor's real birth date, his actual social security number, and the name of his childhood pet. I told her that if she wanted immediate physical proof, she should make him roll up his left sleeve, describing the small crescent-shaped scar on his forearm from a childhood bike accident. Alyssa turned to Trevor, her eyes hardening as angry tears filled them. She commanded him to roll up his sleeve. Trevor clutched his left wrist with his right hand. He shook his head frantically, begging her to just leave with him, promising they could leave the resort right now and start over. Alyssa didn't say another word. She swung her arm back and slapped Trevor across the face with everything she had. The crack of the slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. Trevor stumbled back, clutching his cheek, as Alyssa spun around and ran down the hallway, her heavy sobs fading into the distance. Trevor watched his billionaire safety net vanish right before his eyes. He let out a raspy, furious roar, turning his venomous glare back to me, his hands clenching into tight fists. He lunged across the room, grabbing my shoulders and slamming my back hard against the wall, spitting words of pure rage, screaming that I had just ruined his life. Before he could do anything else, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. The resort's security team burst through the open door. The moment I had heard Trevor kick my door in earlier, I had quietly texted the front desk emergency line. 4 heavy-set security guards tackled Trevor to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. I straightened my linen dress and rubbed my bruised shoulder. Looking down at the man struggling on the carpet, I calmly ordered the guards to remove the intruder from my room. Trevor was dragged out, kicking and screaming empty threats that faded away as they reached the service elevator. I took a deep, trembling breath. The immediate danger was gone, but the real war was far from over. I had to get my son. I stepped over my ruined luggage and headed down the corridor toward the secure resort daycare where I had left Leo. But as I turned the final corner toward the main atrium, a wall of pure hostility blocked my way. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were marching down the hall, shoulder to shoulder. Cameron looked like he was on the verge of a medical emergency. His phone was pressed to his ear, his face a deep, angry purple. He slammed the phone down and roared at me, his voice echoing off the marble walls. He screamed that Warren Bradley had just pulled out of the merger. The deal was dead. Alyssa had called her father, and the billionaire investor had cut all ties, blacklisting Cameron from the real estate market. Their family's financial lifeline was officially severed. Beatrice was hyperventilating with rage, her perfectly styled hair practically shaking. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest, screaming that I had ruined their family and that they would systematically destroy my life. Simone stepped forward. The ruthless attorney looked completely unhinged, yet her eyes remained ice-cold and calculating. She didn't yell. Instead, like a predator preparing to strike, she was precise and lethal. She held up a thick manila folder stamped with the official state court seal. She told me she had just spent the last hour on the phone with a corrupt, highly paid judge back home. She had used her legal connections to bypass standard procedures and secure an emergency ex parte order. She flashed that creepy, predatory smile. She claimed she had submitted my trashed hotel room, my screaming in the lobby, and my alleged harassment of resort guests as absolute proof of a severe mental breakdown. Simone slammed the folder against my chest, declaring that the document was a legally binding court order, stripping me of my parental custody immediately. She leaned in close, whispering, with chilling triumph, that resort security had already escorted Leo to Beatrice's penthouse suite. If I tried to go near him, I would be arrested for kidnapping. The harsh reality of the legal document in my hands left me breathless. Simone stood before me in her flawless scarlet suit, her dark eyes shining with the thrill of the hunt. She had weaponized the legal system against me with terrifying speed. The ex parte order, signed by a judge who clearly owed her a favor, granted Beatrice immediate temporary custody of my son, citing my alleged instability and violent outbursts. Simone tapped the thick paper with her manicured nail. She told me the local police had already been notified. If I made any move to resist, I would end up in a local jail cell, and she would personally ensure I never crossed the border back to the U.S. Behind Simone, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. 2 large resort security guards stepped out, looking professional and serious, Between them stood Beatrice. My mother-in-law looked absolutely triumphant. The panic she had shown in the restroom was gone, replaced by the arrogance of a woman who believed her wealth placed her above the law. Beatrice pointed toward the childcare suite at the end of the hall. She ordered the guards to accompany her to pick up her grandson, loudly claiming the child's mother was having a severe mental episode and needed to be kept away for his own safety. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to fight, to tear Simone and Beatrice apart with my bare hands. But as a CEO, I knew that losing control in a hostage negotiation was the quickest way to lose the hostage. If I screamed or fought back, I would give Simone the exact proof of instability she needed to make this temporary order permanent. I forced my muscles to relax. I took a slow, deep breath, burying my fear under layers of cold, calculated logic. I told the guards to wait. I said I would bring my son out myself so he wouldn't be frightened by strangers. Simone opened her mouth to object, but I walked straight past her, brushing my shoulder against her red suit, and walked to the childcare suite. I found Leo sitting at a small table, happily coloring a picture of a sea turtle. When he saw me, his face lit up, but his smile faded as he noticed the tension in my posture. I knelt down on the colorful rug to meet his eyes, gently placing my hands on his small shoulders. I kept my voice soft and steady, hiding the absolute war raging inside me. I told Leo we were going to play an important spy game. I explained that his grandmother had a special mission for him up in her big penthouse suite, and he needed to act like a brave undercover agent. Leo's bottom lip trembled. He looked past my shoulder at the large security guards waiting in the hallway. He gripped my arm, his voice tight with fear, asking if I was coming with him. I swallowed the sharp lump of grief in my throat. I looked into his beautiful brown eyes and promised him on my life that I would see him before dinner. I told him he just had to be brave for a couple of hours. I kissed his forehead, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, committing the warmth of his skin to memory. I stood up, took his small hand, and led him out. I handed his small backpack to Beatrice. She snatched it with a victorious smirk, pulling Leo close to her side. Leo looked back at me, tears streaming down his cheeks. Simone flashed a chilling, triumphant smile, telling me to go back to my trashed room and pack my cheap bags. She said the family was done playing games with me. I stood frozen like a statue, watching Beatrice, Simone, and the guards escort my crying son into the elevator. I kept my gaze locked on Simone until the silver doors shut. The moment they closed, the hallway fell into a dead silence. A weaker woman might have collapsed onto the carpet, breaking down in hysterical, paralyzing tears. But I didn't shed a single tear. The fragile, grieving widow they thought they could bully was gone. The protective mother in me was fully awake, and she was out for blood. I turned on my heel and walked past my trashed room, heading down to the lobby level, and straight into the resort's private, executive business center. I locked the heavy glass door behind me, pulled down the privacy blinds, and sat at a high-end terminal. I pulled out my phone and launched my encrypted video link to Miles. Miles picked up immediately. Sitting in his Manhattan office, he took one look at my face, and his casual greeting died in his throat. He sat up straight and grabbed a pen. He knew exactly what that look meant. All-out war, no mercy. I didn't waste a second on small talk. I told him Simone had weaponized a corrupt judge to take custody of my son and that the gloves were off. I didn't just want an emergency motion to counter her custody claim. I wanted the complete, systematic destruction of Cameron's real estate empire and Beatrice's family trust. I ordered Miles to deploy every forensic accountant on our payroll. I wanted to know exactly who held the debt on Cameron's commercial properties and which banks held the mortgages on Beatrice's assets. I wanted to find the structural weakness in their financial fortress. Miles nodded. He told me to give him 20 minutes and put me on a secure hold. I sat in the quiet room, staring at the flashing digital clock on the monitor. Every minute without my son felt like physical torture. But I channeled that pain into absolute, calculated focus. I was going to strip away everything that gave them power. Exactly. 18 minutes later, Miles came back on screen, looking like he had just struck gold. A rare, dangerous smile spread across his face. He told me he had found the kill shot. Miles explained that Beatrice and Cameron had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. 4 years ago, when Trevor faked his death, they used the $10 million fraudulent life insurance payout as the primary collateral to secure a massive line of credit from a private equity group. That line of credit saved Cameron's failing real estate firm. Even better, that same line of credit held the primary mortgage on the very resort we were standing in. Miles leaned into the camera, explaining the domino effect. Because their entire family shell trust was leveraged, using a fraudulent insurance policy, their collateral was toxic. The moment the primary lender discovered the fraud, it would trigger a mandatory, immediate default cascade. The bank would call in the loans, throwing the entire family into sudden, catastrophic bankruptcy. But Miles had a much better idea than just reporting them to the bank. He told me the private equity group holding their debt was currently liquidating assets to cover quarterly losses. They were quietly selling off Cameron's debt portfolio to private buyers. A cold, ruthless smile curved my lips. I looked at Miles and delivered the final, devastating order. I told him to use the capital from our recent $80 million tech buyout. I ordered him to buy their debt. All of it. Right now. With a surge of absolute power, I realized that before dinner, I wouldn't just have my son back. I would legally own the very ground my enemies stood on. I was going to legally foreclose on every corner of their existence. I disconnected the call, stood up from the leather chair, and left the business center. It was time to visit Beatrice's penthouse suite. It was time to show them what happens when you try to steal a child from a CEO. The walk from the business center to the private penthouse elevator felt like marching to an execution. I swiped the temporary VIP keycard Miles had digitally cloned for me, granting me access to the resort's highest floor. The glass elevator shot upward, unfolding the stunning Cabo San Lucas coastlines below. But I didn't care about the view. I only cared about the boy trapped at the top of the tower. The elevator opened with a chime, revealing a private foyer with imported marble and modern art. I didn't knock. I pushed the double doors to the penthouse open and walked right in. The luxury of the suite was staggering, but the air was thick with tension. Beatrice sat on a white leather sofa, sipping sparkling water, desperately trying to maintain her arrogant composure. Cameron paced anxiously near the floor-to-ceiling windows, obsessively checking his phone. Simone sat at a glass dining table, organizing a stack of legal documents with chilling precision. Trevor was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in another room. As a coward, he didn't have the stomach to face the fallout of his ruined billionaire marriage plans. Simone looked up as I entered, showing no surprise. She looked at me like a spider waiting for a fly to stumble into her web. She tapped the stack of papers on the table and ordered me to sit. She claimed she knew I would crawl back once I faced reality. She mocked my performance at the charity dinner, calling it a cute party trick, but saying this was the major leagues. She pointed to the chair across from her, demanding I sit so we could discuss the terms of my complete surrender. I walked slowly across the room, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. I pulled out the chair and sat down, completely relaxed. I clasped my hands on the glass table, looked at Simone and told her I was listening. Beatrice let out a smug, triumphant laugh from the sofa, telling Cameron she always knew I was a weak girl who would fold at the first sign of trouble. Cameron stopped pacing, crossing his arms with a smug grin. They truly believed they had me cornered. Simone slid a thick, bound contract across the table and pushed a heavy gold pen toward me. She explained the terms with ruthless efficiency, requiring me to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering everything about Trevor, the life insurance policy, and the family trust. She demanded the master files of the cloud recordings, foolishly thinking I had the power to erase records from a federal database. In exchange for my absolute silence, she would generously tear up the temporary custody order and let me leave the resort with Leo. She leaned across the table, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She told me to sign the papers and go back to my miserable life with my kid, warning me she might change her mind and have me committed if I hesitated. I looked down at the contract, then at the gold pen. I picked up the pen, letting out a long, defeated sigh, playing the role of the heartbroken, terrified mother they wanted to see. I uncapped the pen and hovered the nib over the signature line. I heard Beatrice sigh with satisfaction, and Cameron let out a soft chuckle. I lowered the pen to the paper, but I didn't sign my name. I didn't write Paige Kensington at the bottom of their threats. Instead, I wrote 3 simple words. Check your email. I tossed the pen onto the contract and slid it back to Simone. She frowned, her perfect brows knitting together in confusion. She looked down at the signature line, read the words, and glared up at me, opening her mouth to ask what game I was playing. But before she could speak, her phone on the table let out a sharp alert. A second later, the phone in Cameron's pocket vibrated frantically. Then, Beatrice's phone on the sofa buzzed. Simone grabbed her phone and unlocked the screen. It was a high-priority emergency alert from the SEC, forwarded directly by her senior partners back in New York. I leaned back in my chair, watching the color drain completely from her face. The cold, arrogant corporate lawyer turned as white as chalk. Her jaw went slack, and her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the device. Cameron pulled his phone out and read the exact same alert. He let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the glass windows. I smiled, the smile of a CEO who had just executed a flawless corporate strike. I stood up from the table. I told them my holding company had just completed a full buyout of their primary lender's non-performing debt portfolio. Speaking slowly and clearly, I explained that since Cameron's firm was legally categorized as toxic, I had bought out his commercial debt for pennies on the dollar. I took a step toward Cameron, my voice echoing in the dead silent penthouse. I told him, I own your cars, your house, and the primary mortgage on the resort we are standing in right now. I turned to face Simone's shattered expression, telling her that the federal fraud investigation into the insurance payout meant I had the legal right to declare all of their loans in default immediately. I was no longer their charity case. On paper, I was now their biggest creditor, and I owned their entire livelihood. Cameron snapped, realizing that the woman he despised had just bought his entire life. He flew into a blind, desperate rage. He swore viciously, lunging across the room with his fist raised to strike me. He didn't even make it past the coffee table. The double doors to the suite burst open. Two massive men in black suits rushed in, intercepting Cameron instantly. One guard grabbed his raised arm, twisting it behind his back, slamming his face hard against the marble wall. These weren't resort security. These were top-tier private security guards I had hired from Mexico City hours ago, paid for by the very wealth this family had tried to mock. The room erupted into sheer panic. Beatrice began clutching her chest, hyperventilating. Simone tapped frantically on her phone, desperately trying to call her banking contacts to verify the nightmare. I ignored them all and stepped directly in front of Beatrice, my voice a deadly, non-negotiable command. I demanded she hand over my son immediately, telling her that if Leo wasn't in my arms in 60 seconds, I would foreclose on every asset she owned before sunset. Beatrice looked up at me, tears of real, absolute panic streaming down her face. She shook her head, whimpering pathetically. She told me Leo wasn't in the penthouse. She sobbed, pointing a trembling finger toward the balcony, crying that Trevor had taken him. She claimed Trevor had panicked when he heard about the federal agents and had taken Leo as leverage to escape. My blood turned to ice. My corporate victory evaporated in a second, replaced by a mother's blind, visceral terror. Trevor had taken my son. I spun around, ignoring the weeping woman on the couch. I pulled out my phone, launching the tracking app I had kept active since becoming a single mother. 3 years ago, I had sewn a tiny, waterproof GPS chip into the lining of Leo's favorite denim jacket. It had been a paranoid habit, but now it was going to save his life. A pulsing red dot appeared on the screen, moving quickly away from the resort, heading straight toward the private marina at the edge of the peninsula. Trevor was trying to charter a boat to take my son into international waters. I turned to my security team, my voice sharp as broken glass. I told them we were heading to the marina. We were going to hunt a ghost. We rushed out of the penthouse, leaving my ruined, bankrupt in-laws weeping on the floor. I didn't look back. If Trevor hurt a single hair on my son's head, I would tear him apart with my bare hands. The clock was ticking, and I was heading to that marina, with the full weight of my empire behind me. Tires screeched as my private security team slammed the brakes on our armored SUV at the Cabo San Lucas marina. Before the vehicle even stopped, the smell of diesel and salt water hit me, and I flung the door open and sprinted out. The marina was a maze of luxury yachts and catamarans bobbing in the fading light. I checked my phone, eyes locked on the pulsing red dot. It was stationary now, at the far end of Dock C near the charter berths. I sprinted, my lungs burning, my heels pounding hard against the wooden docks. My guards flanked me, hands near their belts, scanning the boats like radar. As I rounded the corner of the last walkway, I saw them. Trevor was standing near the stern of a run-down twin-engine yacht, arguing frantically with a sunburnt captain. His hair was a mess, his linen shirt soaked in sweat. He was holding Leo by the collar of his denim jacket, trying to drag him up the boarding ramp. Leo was crying hysterically, his small hands desperately trying to pry his father's fingers off his jacket, screaming for his mom. Hearing my son's terrified cries ignited a fierce, protective rage in my chest. I didn't slow down. I charged down the wooden dock, my voice cutting through the roar of the yacht's engines as I roared Trevor's name, with enough force to halt a train. Trevor spun around. His eyes went wide as he saw me approaching with two massive security guards. He pulled Leo behind his legs, using his own 7-year-old son as a shield. The boat captain took one look at my security team, raised his hands in surrender, and quickly stepped off the boat. Trevor was trapped at the end of the dock, with nowhere to run. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a sleek, dark weapon, aiming it directly at my chest, his hand shaking violently in the humid air. He screamed at my guards to back off, yelling that he had nothing left to lose. He glared at me, his face twisted in desperate rage. He demanded money. He ordered me to open my banking app right now and transfer $5 million to a crypto wallet, threatening to take Leo into international waters where custody laws couldn't reach them. My guards tensed, ready to draw their weapons, but I raised a hand to hold them back. I couldn't risk a crossfire near my son. I looked at the weapon pointed at my chest, then at my crying son, cowering behind a monster. I felt no fear. Trevor was a coward who faked his death because he couldn't face a financial audit. He didn't have the nerve to pull the trigger. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out my wallet. I pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, but I didn't open a banking app. I opened a live video feed, turning the screen so Trevor could see exactly what I was looking at. I told him to look very closely. I explained that this was a direct, secure feed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force in Miami, the same task force that had spent 4 years tracking the missing $10 million, and the same team I had sent his confession to hours ago. I watched Trevor's eyes drop to the screen, recognizing the official government seal on the video player. He could hear the crackle of an agent's voice over the speaker, confirming they had visual confirmation on the suspect. I kept walking forward, slowly closing the distance, staring directly down the trembling barrel. I told him his time was up. I said federal agents had already contacted the Mexican federal police. I pointed toward the marina entrance, and right on cue, the wail of sirens pierced the coastal air, growing louder by the second. Trevor's arrogant facade shattered completely. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally caught up to him. His hand slowly dropped, pointing the weapon down at the wooden dock as he watched the red and blue lights flashing near the entrance. He dropped the weapon with a harmless clatter. Trevor let go of Leo's jacket and collapsed onto his knees, weeping and muttering pathetic apologies, begging me to tell the agents he was forced into this. He looked up, tears streaming down his face, calling me his dear wife and begging for mercy. I didn't even look at him. I stepped past his kneeling form, scooped my crying son into my arms, and buried my face in his neck. I held Leo so tight my arms ached, whispering in his ear that he was safe. The game was over, and Mommy had him. I looked down at the sobbing man on the dock as Mexican police rushed in, with their weapons drawn, shouting orders in Spanish. I stared into Trevor's eyes, my voice absolutely devoid of warmth. I told him my husband had died 4 years ago. I said he was just a ghost, and ghosts belong in the dark. I turned my back on him as the police tackled him to the wooden boards and snapped heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. I carried my son away from the water, shielding his eyes from the pathetic arrest of the man who had never spent a single day being a real father. I placed Leo in the secure back seat of the SUV, wrapped him in a warm blanket, and handed him an iPad with his favorite movie. My security team climbed in, ready to drive us to our new 5-star sanctuary across the bay. But as the engine roared to life, I looked back at the towering resort on the coastline. The feds had Trevor, and my son was safe. But I wasn't finished. There was still a boardroom in that resort with 3 people who had tried to steal my child and ruin my life. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were about to learn what happens when you hand the keys to your financial execution to a CEO. I told the driver to turn back to the resort. It was time for one last family board meeting. The heavy oak doors to the private boardroom burst open with a loud crack. My security guards entered first, blocking the exits, locking the doors from the inside with a heavy metallic click. The room was in complete chaos. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were huddled around a massive mahogany table covered in open laptops and scrambled financial documents, desperately trying to wire funds and shred papers before the authorities arrived. When the lock clicked into place, all 3 froze and turned to face me. The sheer panic in their eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. I walked in, my emerald silk gown rustling softly on the carpet. I didn't raise my voice or rush. I walked straight to the head of the table, the seat of absolute authority, and pulled out the leather chair. I sat down, clasped my hands on the polished wood, and looked at the ruins of the family that had tried to bury me. I told them the board meeting was officially called to order. Cameron was the first to break. He slammed his laptop shut, his face twisted with fear and anger, demanding to know where Trevor was and what I had done to his brother. I offered a warm smile, informing him that his brother was currently in Mexican custody awaiting extradition to face federal insurance fraud charges. I added that Trevor had sung like a canary to secure a plea deal, formally naming Cameron, Beatrice, and Simone as his co-conspirators. Beatrice let out a sharp, choked gasp, clutching her pearl necklace as if the gravity in the room had doubled. She looked at Simone, begging her daughter-in-law to do something and use her legal connections to fix this. Simone didn't move. The ruthless corporate lawyer was staring at her laptop, her dark eyes wide. She was reading the digital death warrant I had just sent to her professional inbox. I leaned forward and addressed Simone directly, asking if she liked the disbarment draft my legal team had prepared for her. I explained that facilitating a $10 million insurance fraud, faking medical documents, and attempting to blackmail a CEO using a corrupt judge was a very quick way to lose her license. I told her the State Bar Association had already received the full recording of her stairwell confession. Simone's flawless composure shattered entirely. Trapped like a cornered predator, her survival instincts took complete control. In a heartbeat, she turned on her own flesh and blood. She pointed a trembling finger at Beatrice, her voice cracking as she shrieked that she was forced into the scheme. She claimed that years ago, Beatrice had threatened to ruin her career if she didn't help hide Trevor's money. She screamed that she was only executing the matriarch's orders to protect the family trust. Beatrice's face turned a violent shade of purple. She lunged across the table and delivered a brutal slap to Simone's face. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom. Beatrice screamed that Simone was a greedy, manipulative liar, claiming she was the one who orchestrated the entire life insurance payout just to fund her own lavish lifestyle. Cameron tried to hold his mother back while shouting at his wife, calling her a traitor. This perfect family, the untouchable elite, who had spent 4 years mocking my struggle and questioning my sanity, were now tearing each other apart like wild dogs over a scrap of meat. I sat at the head of the table, quietly watching their self-destruction. I let them scream and accuse one another for 2 full minutes. It was a beautiful display of poetic justice. When I had seen enough of the drama, I reached into my bag and pulled out the non-disclosure agreement Simone had tried to force me to sign earlier that morning. The document demanding my absolute silence in exchange for a meager trust allowance. I held the paper up. As their eyes locked onto it, the fighting stopped. Slowly and deliberately, I tore the agreement in half. I ripped it again and scattered the pieces across the polished mahogany table. Reaching into my bag once more, I pulled out 3 legally binding eviction notices stamped with the official state court seal and slid them across the glass. They stopped right in front of Cameron. I told them these were immediate eviction notices. Since my holding company now legally owned the resort's toxic debt, I was officially foreclosing on their free penthouse suite. I informed them that their bank accounts were frozen, their credit cards flagged for fraud, and they didn't have a single cent to their names. I ordered them to leave the resort immediately. Cameron stared at the eviction notices, his hands shaking violently. He looked up at me, completely broken, and begged for more time. He claimed they had no cash to book a flight home and had nowhere to go, pleading that we were family and I couldn't just leave them stranded on the streets of a foreign country. I offered no sympathy. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a crumpled bill. It was the exact $100 bill. Beatrice slapped against my chest at breakfast. The one she told me to use to buy my son cheap ice cream, so we wouldn't ruin their social brunch. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the bill across the table. It landed right on top of the eviction notices. I locked eyes with Beatrice and repeated her own words back to her. I told her to take the money and call an Uber, adding that she shouldn't worry because she could handle it. After all, she was tough, wasn't she? Beatrice stared at the bill, her lips trembling as tears of absolute humiliation smudged her mascara and ran down her cheeks. Before any of them could reach for the money, the heavy oak doors opened again. This time it wasn't my security team. A squad of local police officers, accompanied by 2 federal agents who had flown in to coordinate the arrests, marched into the room. They held a stack of international warrants for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and extortion. The agents ordered Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone to put their hands behind their backs. I stood up from the head of the table, smoothing the emerald silk of my gown. I walked past my in-laws in silence, as cold steel cuffs were locked around their wrists. I stepped out of the boardroom and into the brightly lit resort corridor. The air felt incredibly light, the suffocating weight of the last 4 years entirely gone. But as I walked toward the elevator, Simone's voice echoed down the hall. Desperate and dangerous, she wasn't giving up the fight. She screamed my name, struggling against the agents. She yelled that she had hidden files, claiming she had hacked sensitive commercial data from my servers. She threatened that the moment she got her phone call, she would leak the files to my biggest competitor, vowing to destroy my $80 million empire just like I had destroyed her. I stopped and turned back to face her as the agents held her firmly. I gave her a calm, almost pitying smile. I decided to explain basic corporate law to the senior partner. I told her she had just loudly admitted to violating attorney-client privilege, committing extortion, and engaging in corporate espionage in front of federal agents. My smile widened as I informed her that my company's stock would actually soar once Wall Street saw how ruthlessly I eliminated threats to my empire. Simone's mouth snapped shut. The fight drained from her eyes as she finally realized she had lost everything. The agents escorted Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone down the grand staircase, parading them right through the main lobby, the exact lobby where they had tried to paint me as a madwoman just hours before. Now, they were the spectacle. They were paraded in handcuffs past the elite investors, socialites, and venture capitalists they had spent the entire weekend trying to impress. Richard Montgomery stood by the bar, watching their disgraceful exit with deep disgust. I stood on the mezzanine balcony, watching the police cars pull away from the resort gates, their lights flashing through the palm trees. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was Miles. I answered, my voice steady. Miles confirmed that the offshore accounts were seized, the real estate debt was acquired, and the family trust was officially bankrupt. The financial war was over. I had won. But before I could truly go home, there was one final, deeply personal matter to resolve. The next morning, the news broke nationally. Headlines dominated every major network and financial publication. Dead man rises in Cabo. Wealthy real estate family charged in massive insurance fraud. The media frenzy was absolute chaos, but I didn't hide. I met it head on. I sat down for an exclusive, highly coordinated television interview with a top financial network. I didn't sit in a dark room wiping away tears, playing the victim. I wore a sharp, tailored suit in a modern Manhattan boardroom. I spoke not as a victim, but as a victorious CEO who had used her corporate intelligence network to expose a major federal fraud ring. I controlled the narrative entirely, painting Trevor and his family as desperate criminals who made the fatal mistake of underestimating the wrong woman. My company's stock, as expected, went through the roof. With my public victory secured, I handled the most important legal matter of my life. I walked into a family court judge's office and legally changed Leo's last name to my maiden name, Kensington. With a few strokes of a pen, Trevor was completely erased from my son's birth certificate, gone from our lives forever. A month later, the dust finally settled. Trevor, Cameron, and Simone were held in federal custody awaiting trial, facing decades behind bars. Beatrice, having secured a plea deal by turning on her own children, was serving a lighter sentence at a minimum security facility in upstate New York. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a thick cream envelope arrived at my office, stamped with the return address of the Federal Correctional Institution. It was a handwritten letter from Beatrice. I opened it with a silver letter opener. The handwriting was shaky and desperate. Over 3 pages, Beatrice begged for my forgiveness. She claimed the prison food was making her sick, that she was terrified of the other inmates, and pleaded with me to use my vast resources to set up a defense fund for her appeal. She closed her pathetic letter using the exact manipulative language she had used to control me for years. "Please help me, Paige. We are family." I read the letter with a blank face. I didn't throw it away, and I didn't give it to my lawyers. I buzzed my assistant and cleared my schedule for the afternoon. I was going to visit that prison. I was going to deliver my answer in person. The visiting room of the correctional facility was bleak, smelling of industrial bleach and desperation. I sat at a metal table bolted to the linoleum floor. I didn't bring a lawyer. I was entirely alone, dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored white power suit that cost more than Beatrice's remaining net worth. The heavy steel door buzzed open, and Beatrice was escorted in by a guard. The transformation was shocking. The arrogant matriarch who once ruled the country club was gone. She wore a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit. Her hair had turned completely gray, with inches of dark roots showing. She looked weak, tired, and broken. She sat across from me, her hands trembling on the metal table. Looking at my pristine white suit, then up at my face, she burst into tears. She began to speak in a desperate whisper, thanking me for coming, and launching into another plea for financial help. I raised a manicured hand, cutting her off instantly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal. I looked straight into the eyes of the woman who had tried to convince the world I was crazy. My voice was calm, steady, and colder than the concrete walls around us. I told Beatrice that she had never truly seen me. I explained that she only saw a fragile girl she thought she could break, a charity case she could control to feed her own ego. I lowered my voice to a whisper, telling her that the suffocating weight she and her family had placed on me didn't break me. Instead, it turned me into a diamond. I smiled and leaned back. I told her that while I was running a global empire and raising a brilliant, happy son, she would spend the rest of her life in a concrete room, knowing every single second that she put herself there. Beatrice let out a choked sob, reaching across the table to grab my hand, begging me not to leave her in a place like this. I smoothly pulled my hand away. Reaching into my suit pocket, I pulled out a glossy color photograph and slid it face up across the table. It was a photo of Leo and me from last week, laughing on the deck of my new luxury yacht in the sunshine. We looked wealthy, incredibly happy, and absolutely free. I stood up and buttoned my jacket, looking down at Beatrice as she wept over the picture. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the visiting room. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me with a metallic clang, cutting off her desperate cries. I stepped out of the facility and into the bright autumn afternoon. The air smelled of pure freedom. I walked past the barbed wire fences toward my waiting SUV, where my son was safely buckled in the back seat, happily playing a game. I climbed into the back, wrapped my arms around Leo, and gave him a tight hug. He giggled and rested his head on my shoulder. The driver put the car in gear, but we weren't going home. We had one final destination before this chapter closed forever. We drove to a private airport outside the city. Resting on the tarmacs was a sleek, brand-new Gulfstream private jet, its engines humming softly, awaiting my command. As we walked up the stairs into the luxurious leather cabin, I took a moment to reflect on the last 4 years. I had survived being the family scapegoat. I had endured playing the fragile widow. I had tolerated their mockery of my work. Leaning back into the plush seat, I realized my true superpower was never the $80 million. My strength was my ability to walk through their darkness without letting it corrupt my soul. I had survived their fire and used it to forge a crown. Leo buckled his seatbelt and looked out the window at the receding terminal. He turned to me, his brown eyes full of curiosity, and asked if we would ever go back to see the bad people who made me sad. I smiled, reaching over to smooth a stray lock of hair from his forehead. I looked at the boy, who was the center of my universe, the child I had fought a war to protect. I told him, "No, sweetie. We only fly forward." The jet accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the endless blue sky. I leaned back, accepting a glass of vintage champagne from the flight attendant. Taking a slow, satisfying sip, I looked out at the horizon. The sweetest revenge isn't just dismantling the monsters who tried to destroy you. It's living a life so beautiful and untouchable that they can never, ever reach you again. As the plane climbed into the sunset, leaving the ghosts exactly where they belonged, I smiled.